When 7-year-old Elle Bennett lost her mother to cancer, her small world was shattered into pieces she thought could never be mended. But during the somber funeral service, Johnny Depp himself arrived, bringing a pirate chest with him and a plan to change this little girl's life forever. Watch until the end to find out how this heartbreaking story unfolded. You don't want to miss this one. The cold, grey morning enveloped the cemetery like a heavy shroud, casting a somber pall over the rows of silent gravestones. 7-year-old Elle Bennett stood motionless beside a polished mahogany casket, her small frame appearing fragile and lost in the black mourning dress that hung loosely on her thin shoulders. The overcast sky above seemed to mirror the grief etched on her young face, her eyes fixed on the casket that rested above an open grave, poised for its final descent. A gentle breeze rustled through the nearby trees, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and freshly turned earth. Elle shivered, not from the cold, but from the finality of the moment. Her mother, Sharon Bennett, lay within that beautiful wooden box, forever out of reach. Just a few feet away, a newly placed marble tombstone stood as a stark reminder of the day's grim purpose. Elle's eyes were drawn to it, taking in the crisp engraving of her mother's name and the photograph that adorned its surface. The image showed Sharon Bennett as Elle remembered her best, a smiling woman in a blue floral dress, her eyes bright with life and love. The contrast between that vibrant image and the cold reality of the casket was almost too much for Elle to bear. The funeral gathering was notably small, a testament to the family's isolation and limited means. Besides Elle, only her grandmother Agnes Bennett, a solemn-faced priest, and 3 funeral personnel were present. The small group stood in a loose semicircle around the grave, their silence broken only by the occasional sniffle or rustle of clothing. As the funeral personnel began to make final preparations for lowering the casket, Ella felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to speak. She took a small step forward, her voice barely a whisper, as she said, "I'm sorry I couldn't help you, Mummy." The words caught in her throat, threatening to dissolve into sobs. Agnes, sensing her granddaughter's distress, quickly wrapped her arms around Elle's shoulders. "Shh, darling," she murmured softly, her own voice thick with emotion. "Your mother is in a better place now. She's not hurting anymore." Elle leaned into her grandmother's embrace, drawing comfort from the familiar scent of lavender that always clung to Agnes's clothes. She wanted to believe her grandmother's words, to imagine her mother free from pain and at peace. But the ache in her chest told her that, whatever peace her mother might have found, those left behind were still suffering. The priest, a kind-faced man with greying hair, stepped forward and cleared his throat gently. "Shall we begin?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of compassion that seemed to soften the harsh reality of the moment. Agnes nodded, giving Elle's shoulders a gentle squeeze before releasing her. The small group gathered closer as the priest opened his prayer book and began to speak. "We are gathered here today to commit Sharon Bennett to her eternal rest," the priest intoned, his voice carrying across the empty cemetery. "Though her time with us was cut short, we remember the love she shared, the lives she touched, and the legacy she leaves behind." As the priest continued his solemn prayer, Elle found her gaze drawn once more to her mother's photograph on the tombstone. She tried to reconcile the smiling woman in the picture with the still form that lay in the casket before her. It seemed impossible that someone so full of life could simply cease to be. The morning breeze picked up, rustling through the nearby trees with a soft whisper that almost sounded like her mother's voice. Ella closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine for just a moment that her mother was there, wrapping her in a warm embrace despite the chilly weather and telling her everything would be all right. The priest's words washed over her, speaking of hope and resurrection, of a life beyond death. Elle wondered if her mother could hear them, if she was watching from somewhere beyond the grey sky above. She hoped so. She hoped her mother knew how much she was loved and missed already. As the prayer neared its end, the funeral personnel moved into position, ready to begin the process of lowering the casket. Elle felt her heart begin to race. This was it, the final goodbye. Once that casket disappeared into the earth, it would be real, final, irreversible. She wanted to cry out, to beg them to stop, to give her just one more moment with her mother, but the words caught in her throat, trapped behind a wall of grief too immense for her young heart to express. Agnes seemed to sense her granddaughter's turmoil. She placed a comforting hand on Elle's shoulder, squeezing gently. "It's okay to cry, sweetheart," she whispered. "Your mother would understand." Ella nodded, feeling the first hot tears begin to spill down her cheeks. She didn't try to wipe them away, letting them fall freely as a testament to her love and loss. The priest's voice rose in a final benediction, asking for God's blessing on Sharon's soul and comfort for those left behind. As his words faded into the still morning air, a heavy silence fell over the small gathering. It was in this moment of quiet reflection that something unexpected occurred, an event that would change the course of the day, and indeed, the lives of those present. The silence that had settled over the cemetery was suddenly broken by a flurry of whispers from the funeral personnel. Their eyes were fixed on a point beyond the grave, expressions of confusion and disbelief etched on their faces. Elle, curious despite her grief, turned to see what had captured their attention. Her eyes widened in surprise as she saw a figure approaching, a man dressed in an elegant black suit that seemed at odds with the peculiar accessory perched atop his head, a Captain Jack Sparrow pirate hat. As the man drew closer, Elle felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't just any man in a pirate hat, it was Johnny Depp himself, looking both solemn and slightly out of place as he made his way towards their small gathering. The priest, caught off guard by this unexpected interruption, paused mid-prayer. The sudden silence drew all attention to the surreal moment unfolding before them. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath, the leaves of nearby trees stilling as if in anticipation. Johnny Depp approached with careful respect, his steps measured and deliberate. In his hands, he carried an old wooden chest, its worn appearance adding to the peculiar nature of his arrival. The chest looked like something straight out of a pirate movie, weathered and mysterious. As he reached the edge of their small circle, Johnny crouched down, bringing himself to Elle's eye level. With a gentle movement, he removed the pirate hat, holding it respectfully against his chest. His eyes, kind and filled with empathy, met Elle's gaze. "Hello, Elle," he said softly, his voice carrying just a hint of that familiar Jack Sparrow drawl. "I hope you don't mind me joining you today. I have something for you. A gift from your mum." Elle blinked, her grief momentarily overshadowed by confusion and curiosity. She looked up at her grandmother, seeking guidance in this strange situation. Agnes appeared just as bewildered, her brow furrowed as she looked between Johnny and the chest he carried. I'm not sure I understand," she began, her voice hesitant. Johnny nodded, acknowledging their confusion. "I know this must seem very strange," he said, his tone apologetic, "but I promise I'm here with good intentions. Your mum, Sharon, she left some treasures for Ella, things she hoped her daughter would carry forward." He extended the chest towards Ella, his movements slow and gentle. "Would you like to see what's inside?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with a hint of the mischief that made his pirate character so beloved. Ella hesitated, her small hands hovering uncertainly near the chest. She looked up at Agnes once more, silently asking for permission. Agnes, still visibly confused but seemingly unable to find any reason to object, gave a small nod. "Go ahead, sweetheart," she said softly. "Let's see what's inside." With trembling fingers, Elle reached out and lifted the lid of the chest. As it creaked open, she gasped softly at the contents revealed within. Inside the chest lay a collection of precious family heirlooms. A delicate gold locket caught the dim morning light, its surface etched with intricate designs. Beside it rested 2 wedding rings, one larger, one smaller, their simple bands speaking of a love that had endured. And beneath these treasures lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn soft with age and use. Elle's fingers hovered over each item, her eyes wide with wonder and a touch of sadness. She recognized these things, treasures her mother had shown her, items that held special meaning. "The locket," she whispered, carefully lifting it from the chest. "Mummy used to wear this all the time." Johnny nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "That's right, and now it's yours to keep if you'd like." Elle clutched the locket to her chest, feeling as if she were holding a piece of her mother close to her heart. Her gaze then fell on the wedding rings, and a small frown creased her brow. "These were Mommy and Daddy's," she said softly. But they should stay with Mommy, shouldn't they?" Johnny's eyebrows raised slightly, impressed by the young girl's thoughtfulness. "That's a very kind thought, Ella," he said. "What do you think we should do?" Elle considered for a moment, her young face serious with concentration. Finally, she looked up at Johnny and Agnes. "I want to keep the locket," she said firmly, "and the journal, but can we put the rings with Mommy, so she can keep them forever?" Agnes felt tears welling in her eyes at her granddaughter's words. She knelt down beside Ella, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "That's a wonderful idea, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I think your Mommy would love that." Johnny nodded in agreement. "A perfect choice," he said. He carefully closed the chest, now containing only the wedding rings. With a glance at the funeral personnel, who had been watching the scene unfold with a mix of confusion and awe, he asked, "Would it be possible to place this with Sharon?" One of the funeral workers stepped forward, nodding. "Of course, sir. We can arrange that right away." As the chest was carefully placed alongside the casket, ready for its final descent, the priest cleared his throat gently. Shall we continue with the service?" he asked, still seeming a bit bewildered by the turn of events. Johnny stepped back, joining the small circle around the grave. "Please," he said, "and I apologize for the interruption. Please carry on." As the priest resumed the religious service, Elle stood between her grandmother and Johnny Depp, clutching her mother's locket in one hand and the journal in the other. The presence of the Hollywood star added an otherworldly quality and curiosity to the intimate ceremony, as if the lines between reality and fantasy had blurred for a moment. The service continued, the priest's words of comfort and hope filling the air. Elle listened while watching the casket lowered into the earth, her young mind grappling with concepts too big for her to fully comprehend. But she understood love, she understood memory, and as she held her mother's locket and journal close, she felt a connection to her mother that transcended the barrier of death. As the final prayers were spoken, she felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude washing over her. When the time came for the final ritual, the funeral personnel offered the traditional shovel for the closing of the grave. Agnes stepped forward first, her hand trembling slightly as she took the shovel. With a deep breath, she scooped up a small amount of earth and let it fall onto the casket below. Johnny followed, his actions respectful and solemn as he took his turn with the shovel. Though he had never known Sharon Bennett in life, the weight of the moment was not lost on him. The soft thud of earth hitting wood seemed to echo in the quiet cemetery. Finally, it was Elle's turn. Agnes knelt beside her, and together they grasped the shovel. Ella's small hands were dwarfed by her grandmother's, but she held on tightly as they lifted a scoop of earth together. "Goodbye, Mommy," Elle whispered as they tipped the shovel, watching the earth fall. "I love you." As the last of the earth fell, marking the completion of the ritual, a sense of finality settled over the group. The priest offered a few last words of comfort, and then, with quiet efficiency, the funeral personnel began to pack up their equipment. One by one, they approached Agnes and Ella, offering quiet condolences before making their way out of the cemetery. The priest was the last to leave, pausing to place a comforting hand on Agnes's shoulder before he too departed. And then there were three, Ella, Agnes, and Johnny Depp, standing before the fresh grave in the grey morning light. The departure of the others marked a transition from the formal ceremony to a more personal moment of grieving. As they stood there, the reality of the situation seemed to settle more heavily on Elle's small shoulders. She clutched the locket and journal tighter, as if they were lifelines connecting her to the mother she had lost. The grey morning seemed to stretch on endlessly, the overcast sky a fitting backdrop to their grief. The silence that fell over the small group was heavy with unspoken emotions. Elle stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the mound of fresh earth that now covered her mother's casket. In her hands, she still clutched the locket and journal, treasures that now felt both precious and painfully bittersweet. As the last echoes of the funeral service faded away, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind through the cemetery trees. The weight of loss seemed to press down even more heavily on the small group gathered around Sharon Bennett's grave. The departure of the priest and funeral personnel had stripped away the last vestiges of formality, leaving raw emotion in its wake. Johnny Depp remained a respectful distance away, his presence both comforting and slightly surreal in the somber setting. He watched as Elle's small fingers traced the contours of the locket, her touch gentle and reverent. After several long moments, Elle's gaze shifted to the journal. Its worn cover spoke of years of use, of thoughts and memories carefully recorded within its pages. She ran her fingers over the soft leather, imagining her mother's hands doing the same. "This was Mommy's," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wrote in it every night." Agnes nodded, her eyes misting with tears. "That's right, sweetheart. Your mother loved that journal. She said it helped her keep all her important memories safe." Elle looked up at Johnny, her young face serious. "And you're sure I can keep it?" she asked, a hint of worry in her voice. Agnes felt a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill over. She knelt beside Ella, wrapping an arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "That's more than okay. It's a beautiful idea." Agnes Bennett, who had been a pillar of strength throughout the service, suddenly felt her composure crumble. Her shoulders began to shake as silent sobs racked her body. She sank to her knees beside the fresh mound of earth, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the cold marble of the headstone. "Oh, Sharon," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My sweet girl. A daughter should not leave before their mother. It's not right. It's not fair." Elle, witnessing her grandmother's breakdown, felt a surge of protectiveness that belied her young age. Despite her own grief, she stepped forward, wrapping her small arms around Agnes's shaking shoulders. "It's okay, Grandma," she said softly, her voice steady even as tears threatened to spill from her own eyes. "Mommy wouldn't want us to be sad. She'd want us to remember the happy times." Agnes turned, enveloping Elle in a tight embrace. "Oh, my darling," she murmured. "You're so brave, just like your mother." Ella held her grandmother close, offering what comfort she could. After a moment she pulled back slightly, her young face serious as she looked up at Agnes. "Grandma," she said, her voice filled with a maturity beyond her years, "thank you for giving Mommy such a beautiful funeral. The flowers and the nice coffin, and even our pretty dresses. It must have cost so much. But it made everything feel special, just like Mommy was special." Agnes felt her heart constrict at Elle's words. The innocence of her granddaughter's assumption brought a fresh wave of pain and guilt. She glanced up at Johnny Depp, who had been standing quietly nearby, giving them space in their moment of grief. His presence suddenly reminded her of the strange circumstances surrounding this day. With a deep breath, Agnes gently took Elle's hands in her own. "Oh, sweet child," she said, her voice trembling, "you know we cannot afford this nice funeral by ourselves. The tombstone, the nice coffin, even our dresses. These were not things we could have managed on our own." Elle's brow furrowed in confusion. "But if we didn't pay for it, who did?" Agnes's eyes moved questioningly to Johnny. "The hospital gave us some cryptic information about a special benefactor," she said slowly. "Someone who had arranged for all of this. I didn't understand at the time, but now—" She trailed off, her gaze fixed on the actor. Johnny remained silent, his expression unreadable. The lack of denial seemed to confirm Agnes's suspicion. "You came all this way," Agnes said, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "You must have arranged all of this for us, for Sharon. But why? How did you even know about us?" Johnny shifted slightly, seeming almost embarrassed by the attention. It's a long story," he said softly. "One that perhaps is better told somewhere more comfortable. The important thing is that Sharon received the care and respect she deserved in her final moments and after." Agnes nodded slowly, overwhelmed by this revelation. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Ella, who had been listening to this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly piped up. "Mr. Depp," she said, her voice small but clear, "did you know my mommy?" Before Johnny could respond, a low rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Dark clouds that had been gathering throughout the morning now threatened imminent rain. Agnes looked up, concern crossing her face. "We should get out of this weather," she said, struggling to her feet. "There's a cafe not far from here. Perhaps we could continue our conversation there." Ella clutched the journal tighter to her chest at the mention of rain, clearly protective of this precious memento of her mother. Johnny noticed the gesture and nodded in agreement. "Actually," he said gently, "if you're comfortable with it, perhaps we could talk at your home instead. It might be more private, and I'm sure Ella would feel better having her mother's things safely inside." Agnes hesitated for a moment, clearly torn. She opened her mouth, seemingly about to argue, but before she could speak, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. "All right," she conceded quickly. "Let's hurry to the car before we're soaked through." As they rushed towards the cemetery exit, Elle keeping her mother's journal and locket safely shielded under her coat, the rain began to fall in earnest. The grey morning had turned into a stormy afternoon, mirroring the tumultuous emotions of the day. Johnny guided them to his car, a modest sedan rather than the limousine one might expect from a Hollywood star. His choice of vehicle spoke volumes about his desire to keep the situation low-key and personal. As they settled into the car, the sound of rain beating against the windows created a cocoon of white noise around them. Through the rearview mirror, Johnny watched as Elle carefully examined her mother's locket, her small fingers tracing its intricate design. The drive was mostly silent, each occupant lost in their own thoughts. Elle continued to explore her mother's possessions, while Agnes stared out the window, her mind clearly grappling with the day's unexpected turns. As they neared their destination, Elle's curiosity got the better of her. She opened the locket, only to find it empty, no photographs within its delicate frame. Yet her fingers recognized the familiar texture, confirming its authenticity through memories of times her mother had shown it to her. "It's empty," she said softly, a note of disappointment in her voice. Agnes turned in her seat, offering a sad smile. "Your mother always said she was waiting for the perfect picture to put in there," she explained gently. "I suppose now you can choose what to put inside." Elle nodded solemnly, closing the locket and holding it close to her heart. As the car turned onto their street, the reality of their situation seemed to hit Agnes anew. She straightened in her seat, a look of embarrassment crossing her face. "Mr. Depp," she began hesitantly, "I should warn you, our home, it's not—" But her words trailed off as they pulled up in front of a single-story house that bore visible signs of hardship. The garden was brown and lifeless, paint peeled from the walls, and weathered wood showed clear signs of deterioration. Agnes's face flushed with shame. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. "Our garage door has been broken for months and we've never been able to fix it. You'll have to park outside." Johnny's voice was gentle as he replied, "Not a problem at all, Mrs. Bennett. Please don't worry about it." As the car came to a stop, the rain continued to pour down in sheets. Johnny held up a hand, gesturing for Agnes and Elle to wait. Despite the downpour, he insisted on proper courtesy, stepping out of the car and retrieving an umbrella from his trunk. With careful attention, he escorted first Agnes and then Elle to their front door, shielding them from the worst of the rain. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about his character and his genuine desire to help. As Agnes fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking slightly from cold and emotion, Ella looked up at Johnny with wide, serious eyes. "Thank you for bringing us home, Mr. Depp," she said solemnly. "Would you like to come inside? Grandma makes really good tea." Agnes paused, key in the lock, and turned to Johnny with a mix of embarrassment and hesitant hospitality on her face. "Yes, of course," she said quickly. "Please come in out of this dreadful weather. It's the least we can do to thank you for everything." Johnny nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "I'd be honored," he said simply. As Agnes pushed open the front door, the interior of the Bennett home was revealed, and the stark reality of their situation became immediately apparent. The living room and adjoining kitchen stood nearly empty, devoid of the furniture and comforts one would expect to see in a family home. The bare space told a story of systematic sacrifice, each missing piece a testament to the lengths this family had gone to in their struggle against Sharon's illness. Johnny stepped inside, his eyes taking in the scene with a mix of sadness and understanding. The contrast between the home's exterior and its stripped-down interior was striking, speaking volumes about the family's priorities and the depths of their financial hardship. Agnes stood in the center of the room, her face a mask of embarrassment and quiet dignity. I'm so sorry about the state of things," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "We had to sell most of our possessions to fund Sharon's treatment. It was a piece-by-piece process, each item a step towards what we hoped would be her recovery." Elle, seemingly less affected by the barren state of their home, moved to sit cross-legged on the clean but worn carpet. She patted the space beside her, looking up at Johnny with an innocent smile. "You can sit here, Mr. Depp," she offered. "We don't have a sofa anymore, but the floor is comfy." Johnny's heart constricted at the child's easy acceptance of their circumstances. He nodded, carefully lowering himself to sit beside Ella on the floor. "Thank you," he said softly. "This is perfect." Agnes, still visibly uncomfortable with the situation, straightened her shoulders. "Please, let me at least offer you some tea," she insisted, her ingrained sense of hospitality overriding her embarrassment. "It's the least I can do to thank you for your kindness." Before Johnny could protest, Agnes had disappeared into the kitchen. The sounds of cupboards opening and closing, followed by the whistle of a kettle, filled the quiet house. When she returned, she carried a tray with 3 mismatched cups, 2 plastic and 1 chipped ceramic, which she offered to Johnny with obvious concern for maintaining some semblance of proper hospitality. "I'm afraid we don't have much to offer in the way of refreshments," Agnes apologized as she handed out the cups, "but the tea is hot at least." Johnny accepted the chipped cup with a grateful nod. "It's perfect, Mrs. Bennett, thank you." As Agnes settled onto the floor with them, completing their small circle, a moment of awkward silence fell. The sound of rain beating against the windows seemed to underscore the gravity of their situation. Ella, her young mind less burdened by adult social constraints, broke the silence. "Mr. Depp," she said, her voice filled with curiosity, "how did you know my mummy? Did you meet her at the hospital?" Johnny set his teacup down carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Well, Ella," he began, his voice gentle, "the truth is I didn't know your mummy personally, but I learned about her and about you and your grandmother in a rather unexpected way." Agnes leaned forward slightly, her own curiosity piqued. "Yes, I've been wondering about that myself," she admitted. "How did you come to be involved in our situation? And why would you go to such lengths for strangers?" Johnny took a deep breath, his eyes moving between Agnes and Elle. "It all started a few weeks ago," he explained. "I was visiting a friend at the hospital. He'd had a minor accident on a film set. While I was there, I overheard some of the hospital staff talking in the corridor. They were discussing a patient, your mother, Sharon, and the difficult situation her family was in." Elle's eyes widened. "They were talking about us?" Johnny nodded. "They were. They seemed very concerned about your mother's condition and the financial strain it was putting on your family. It touched me deeply. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even after I left the hospital." Agnes's brow furrowed. "But surely with patient confidentiality—" "You're right," Johnny agreed quickly. "They shouldn't have been discussing it where they could be overheard. But I'm glad they did because it allowed me to help. I spoke with the hospital administration, found out what I could about your situation while respecting privacy laws and, well, I decided to do what I could to ease your burden." He paused, his expression serious. "I hope I haven't overstepped or offended you in any way. I know it must seem strange having a stranger involve themselves in your personal matters." Agnes shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Offended? No, not at all. You've shown us such kindness. We are honored by your generosity. I don't understand why. Why would you do so much for people you've never met?" Johnny's gaze softened. "Because sometimes, Mrs. Bennett, we're given opportunities to make a difference in someone's life. When I heard about your struggle, about Sharon's battle with cancer, I couldn't just walk away. I had the means to help, so I did. It's as simple as that. Ella, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "Did you know my mommy had cancer?" she asked, her voice small. "We didn't have enough money to make her better." The innocent question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Agnes drew in a sharp breath, pain flashing across her face. Johnny looked to her, silently asking permission to address Elle's question. Agnes nodded slowly, gathering her strength. "Elle, sweetheart," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Your mother's story is a difficult one, but I think it's time you knew the whole truth." As Agnes prepared to share the full story of Sharon's battle with cancer, the rain outside intensified, creating a somber backdrop to the revelations about to unfold within the Bennett home. Johnny leaned forward slightly, his expression one of gentle encouragement. "Mrs. Bennett," he said softly, "if you're willing to share, I'd very much like to hear Sharon's full story." Agnes nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Ella scooted closer to her grandmother, sensing the gravity of the moment. The room fell silent, save for the steady drumming of rain against the windows, nature providing a solemn soundtrack to the tale about to unfold. "It all began about 2 years ago," Agnes started, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sharon had been feeling unwell for a while, tired all the time, experiencing pain that she couldn't quite explain. At first we thought it was just stress from work and taking care of Ella, but when the symptoms persisted, she finally agreed to see a doctor." Ella's small hand found her grandmother's, offering silent support. Agnes squeezed it gently before continuing. "The doctor ordered some tests, and that's when we received the devastating news: ovarian cancer. It was already in stage 2 by the time they caught it." Agnes's voice broke slightly, the memory of that day clearly still painful. She was so brave when they told her. Her first thought wasn't for herself, but for Elle." Johnny nodded encouragingly, his eyes filled with compassion. "That must have been incredibly difficult for all of you," he said softly. Agnes nodded. "It was, but the real struggle was just beginning. You see, our financial situation was already precarious. Sharon's modest income barely covered our basic needs and bills. When faced with the cost of cancer treatment," she trailed off, shaking her head. Ella, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "So it's true Mommy died because we didn't have enough money?" The innocent question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Agnes drew in a sharp breath, pain flashing across her face. She looked to Johnny as if seeking strength, before turning back to her granddaughter. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mother. She was torn between using our money for her treatment or for your school and admission fee to primary grade. She wanted so desperately to ensure your future, even at the cost of her own health." Johnny's brow furrowed in concern. "Surely there were assistance programs available?" he asked gently. Agnes nodded. "We tried. Sharon and I spent countless hours applying for financial assistance programs, but the process was slow, filled with bureaucratic delays. Months passed as we waited for approvals, all while Sharon's condition worsened." She paused, taking a sip of her now cold tea before continuing. "When we finally received approval, we discovered there were only a few slots available within the year for the subsidized surgery. We had no choice but to wait." Elle's eyes widened in understanding. "Is that why Mommy got sicker? Because we had to wait?" Agnes nodded sadly. "Yes, darling. By the time a slot for the subsidized surgery became available, the cancer had spread aggressively. It had been a year since her diagnosis, and her condition had deteriorated significantly." Johnny leaned forward, his expression troubled. "The surgery was 2 days ago, wasn't it?" he asked softly, piecing together the timeline. Agnes nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Yes, Sharon underwent the surgery, but she didn't make it. She fought so hard for so long, but in the end it was too late." A heavy silence fell over the room as the full weight of Sharon's struggle sank in. Elle curled closer to her grandmother, her small frame shaking with silent sobs. Johnny sat motionless, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. He traced his finger along the rim of the chipped cup. After a moment he spoke, his voice gentle but curious. Mrs. Bennett, if I may ask, why did you sell all your possessions if you were waiting for the subsidized surgery slot? Agnes's face crumpled at the question. Oh, Mr. Depp, she said, her voice breaking. The last 6 months they were hell. Sharon became too sick to work as the cancer progressed aggressively. She had to quit her job. We had no income, mounting debts, and... She trailed off, clearly struggling with what she was about to reveal. And what, Mrs. Bennett? Johnny prompted gently. Agnes took a deep, shuddering breath. We had taken out private loans to cover our expenses while waiting for the surgery. The interest rates were exorbitant, but we were desperate. When we couldn't keep up with the payments, the loan sharks came calling. Elle looked up, her young face etched with fear at the memory. They were scary men, she whispered. They yelled a lot. Agnes pulled Elle close, protective even in her grief. We sold everything we could, furniture, my jewelry, Sharon's wedding ring, even Elle's baby jewelry, gifts from friends when she was born, all gone to those vultures. Johnny's expression darkened at this revelation. Mrs. Bennett, he said carefully, what you're describing, it's illegal. Those men were taking advantage of your desperate situation. Agnes nodded wearily. We knew, but we felt we had no choice. Last month, when we had nothing left in the house to sell, they came here and threatened us. They said they would take our lives if we didn't start paying them back. Elle whimpered softly at the memory, burrowing closer to her grandmother. Agnes stroked her hair soothingly as she continued. Sharon paid them with our last family heirloom, the locket, but they said it wasn't enough. Agnes's voice trembled as she recounted the horrifying memory. Those men, they went to the extent of escorting Sharon and me to dig up Elle's father's grave and retrieve his wedding ring and watch. They had taken everything we had. Johnny's face paled at this revelation, a mix of horror and anger flashing in his eyes. Mrs. Bennett, he said, his voice low and intense, what those men did was not just illegal, it was monstrous. You should have gone to the police. Agnes shook her head, defeat evident in her posture. We were too afraid. They threatened Elle. We couldn't risk it, and now... She trailed off, her eyes filling with fresh tears. Now I fear what will happen when they come next month. We have nothing left to give them. Ella, who had been listening with wide, frightened eyes, suddenly spoke up. Mr. Depp, she said, her voice small but clear, how did you get Mommy and Daddy's rings back? And the locket? And Mommy's journal? You had them in the chest at the cemetery. Agnes nodded, her own curiosity piqued despite her distress. Yes, I've been wondering about that as well. Those items were taken from us. How did they come into your possession? Johnny's expression softened as he turned to address Elle and Agnes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. I think it's best if I show you, he said gently. He tapped the screen a few times before turning it to face them. On the screen was a photograph of 2 wedding rings, unmistakably the ones that had been in the chest at the cemetery. One of my close friends is a police officer, Johnny explained. Last week he told me they had just caught a group of loan sharks who had been tied to several cases of extortion and even murder of those who couldn't pay them back. Agnes gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Elle pressed closer to her grandmother, her young face a mix of fear and curiosity. Johnny continued, his voice gentle but firm. My friend was deeply shaken by the case. He confided in me, sharing some of the details and these pictures. He swiped to another image on his phone, this one showing a group of men in handcuffs being led by police officers. Agnes leaned forward, her eyes widening in recognition. That's them, she whispered, her voice trembling. Those are the men who threatened us. Elle nodded vigorously, her small finger pointing at one of the men in the image. That's the scary man with the loud voice, she said, her voice barely audible. Johnny nodded solemnly. I'm so sorry you had to go through that ordeal, he said, his voice filled with genuine empathy. But I want you to know that these men can't hurt you anymore. They're in custody now, facing serious charges. He swiped to another image on his phone, this one showing a large, organized locker filled with various items. The police found this when they raided the loan shark's hideout, he explained. It seems they were keeping the items they stole as some sort of souvenirs. Agnes closed her eyes, a look of disgust crossing her face. Ella, curious despite the gravity of the situation, leaned forward to get a better look at the image. Johnny zoomed in on one section of the locker. "Look here," he said softly. "There's a tray labeled Sharon Bennett. That's where they found your family's belongings." Elle's eyes widened. "Our things were there?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and hope. Johnny nodded. "Yes, they were. When I found out 2 days ago that the deceased patient in the hospital named Sharon Bennett, I wondered if she might be the same victim whose belongings were in that tray. I contacted my friend. After confirming it was indeed your mother, I asked for his help to return at least the wedding rings and the locket to you." Agnes looked up, her eyes brimming with tears of gratitude. "You did that for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Johnny nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "It was the least I could do. My friend agreed, saying that they had already registered the evidence and were just storing the items. He also gave me your mother's journal, which the men had stolen as well." Elle's brow furrowed in confusion. "I didn't know they took Mommy's journal," she said. Agnes nodded slowly. "I remember your mother looking for it, but with everything else going on, I'm ashamed to say I didn't pay much attention to it at the time." Johnny's expression turned thoughtful. "It's possible the men were looking for valuable information in the journal," he suggested. "That might be why they stole it along with the other items." Elle clutched the journal closer to her chest, as if protecting it from invisible thieves. "Can we get our other things back too?" she asked hopefully. Johnny's face softened at the innocent question. "That's a great question, Elle," he said gently. "The process for reclaiming confiscated items can be complicated, but I'd be more than happy to help you navigate the legal procedures. We'll do our best to recover as many of your family's belongings as possible." Agnes reached out, grasping Johnny's hand in a gesture of profound gratitude. "Mr. Depp," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how we can ever thank you for everything you've done. You've given us back pieces of Sharon we thought were lost forever." Johnny squeezed her hand reassuringly. "There's no need for thanks, Mrs. Bennett. I'm just glad I could help in some small way, and please call me Johnny." As the weight of these revelations settled over the room, the sound of the rain outside seemed to lessen, as if nature itself was acknowledging the shift in the Bennett family's fortunes. The storm that had brought them together was beginning to clear, much like the dark cloud that had hung over their lives for so long. Ella, her young face serious, looked up at Johnny. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Johnny smiled gently at her. "Now, Ella, we start the process of healing and rebuilding. Your mother's memory will live on through you, and through these treasures she left behind, and I promise you, I'll do whatever I can to help you and your grandmother move forward." As Agnes nodded gratefully, wiping away tears, none of them could have predicted the turns their conversation would take next, or the unexpected way in which Sharon Bennett's legacy would continue to touch lives beyond their own. As the weight of their conversation settled over the room, Ella suddenly stood up, her young face etched with a mix of sorrow and determination. She walked over to the window, peering out at the rain-soaked street beyond. The storm had lessened to a gentle shower, mirroring the gradual easing of the emotional tempest within the Bennett home. Agnes watched her granddaughter with concern, her own grief momentarily overshadowed by worry for the child who had lost so much. "Ella, sweetheart," she called softly, "are you all right?" Elle turned back to face the room, her eyes landing on Johnny. "Mr. Depp," she said, her voice small but clear, "can I ask you something?" Johnny nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Elle, what's on your mind?" Elle took a deep breath as if gathering her courage. "Our neighbor, Mr. Tillman, he's sick too, like Mommy was. Do you think you could help him too?" Agnes gasped softly, surprised by her granddaughter's request. "Oh, Ella," she murmured, "that's very thoughtful of you to remember Mr. Tillman at a time like this." Johnny's expression softened, clearly moved by the child's compassion. "That's incredibly kind of you to think of others, Elle," he said gently. "Can you tell me more about Mr. Tillman?" Ella nodded, her words tumbling out in a rush. He lives next door. He used to give me candy when I'd help him with his garden. But now he's in a wheelchair, and he looks so tired all the time. I heard Grandma telling Mommy that he has cancer too, but he can't afford the treatments. Agnes nodded sadly, confirming Elle's words. Robert Tillman, she explained to Johnny. He's been our neighbour for years. A kind man, always ready to lend a hand. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer about 6 months ago. His situation is, well, it's not unlike what Sharon faced. Johnny listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. After a moment he spoke, his voice filled with quiet determination. Ella, he said, I think your mother would be very proud of you for thinking of others, even in your own time of grief, and yes, I'd like to help Mr. Tillman if I can. Elle's face lit up with a glimmer of hope. Really? You'll help him? Johnny nodded, a gentle smile on his face. I'd certainly like to try. In fact, he paused, seeming to make a decision. I think it would be a fitting way to honor your mother's memory. What do you think about that? Agnes reached out, taking Elle's hand in hers. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said softly. Sharon always said that kindness should be passed on. This would be a beautiful way to continue her legacy. Elle nodded vigorously, a spark of life returning to her eyes for the first time since the funeral. Can we go see Mr. Tillman now? She asked eagerly. To tell him the good news? Agnes hesitated, glancing out the window at the light rain still falling. I'm not sure if now is the best time, sweetheart. It's still raining, and Mr. Tillman might be resting. Johnny stood up, brushing off his pants. Actually, he said, if you're comfortable with it, I think now might be perfect. Sometimes hope is the best medicine, and it sounds like Mr. Tillman could use some hope right about now. Agnes considered for a moment, then nodded. You're right, she said, rising to her feet. If you're willing, Mr. Depp, Johnny, then yes, let's go check on Robert. As they prepared to leave, Elle carefully placed her mother's journal and locket on a shelf, promising silently to keep them safe. The trio made their way out of the house, Johnny once again insisting on using his umbrella to shield Agnes and Elle from the light rain. They walked the short distance to Mr. Tillman's house, the wet grass squishing beneath their feet. As they approached the front door, Agnes turned to Johnny. I should warn you, she said quietly. Robert's condition has deteriorated quite rapidly. He may not be, well, it might be a bit of a shock. Johnny nodded solemnly. I understand, thank you for the warning. Agnes knocked gently on the door. After a moment they heard the whir of an electric wheelchair approaching. The door opened to reveal Robert Tillman, his gaunt face a stark contrast to the kind, robust man Ella remembered from her childhood. Mr. Tillman's eyes widened in surprise as he took in the unexpected group on his doorstep, his neighbors, and, inexplicably, a famous Hollywood actor. Agnes? Elle? He said, his voice weak but filled with confusion. What's going on, and is that Johnny Depp? Agnes stepped forward, her voice gentle. Hello, Robert. Yes, it's us, and yes, this is indeed Johnny Depp. We have something important to discuss with you. May we come in? Mr. Tillman nodded, still looking bewildered. He backed his wheelchair up, allowing them to enter his modest home. The interior, while not as bare as the Bennetts, showed signs of financial strain. Medical equipment crowded the living room, and a stack of unpaid bills sat on a nearby table. As they settled in the living room, Mr. Tillman's gaze moved between his visitors, clearly struggling to make sense of the situation. I don't understand, he said weakly. What's this all about? Agnes took a deep breath, preparing to explain. But before she could speak, Elle stepped forward, her young face serious and determined. Mr. Tillman, she said, her voice clear and strong, we came to tell you that you're going to get help, like my mommy should have gotten. Mr. Depp is going to help you fight your cancer. Mr. Tillman's eyes widened, moving from Elle to Johnny in disbelief. What? Is this true? Johnny leaned forward, his expression warm yet serious. Mr. Tillman, he began, I only recently learned about your situation, but if you're open to it, I'd like to help. In honor of Sharon Bennett's memory and moved by her daughter's compassion, I want to make sure you receive the treatment you need. Tears welled up in Mr. Tillman's eyes as the magnitude of this offer sank in. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. It's more than I could have ever hoped for. It's like waking up from a good dream. This is even better than dreams." "I've been thinking," Johnny began, his voice soft but filled with purpose, "about Sharon, about Elle, about you, Mr. Tillman, and about all the others out there facing similar struggles, and I've come to a decision." All eyes in the room turned to him, curiosity and anticipation evident on their faces. "I want to establish a charity," Johnny continued, his words gaining momentum as he spoke. "A foundation focused on helping cancer patients in poverty, people who, like Sharon and Mr. Tillman, find themselves caught between the devastating costs of treatment and the basic needs of daily life." Agnes gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth in surprise. Mr. Tillman leaned forward in his wheelchair, his eyes wide with interest, but it was Elle who spoke first, her young voice filled with excitement. "A charity, like the ones Mommy used to donate to when we had extra money?" Johnny nodded, smiling gently at Ella. "Exactly like that, Ella. But this one would be special. It would be in honor of your mother, to continue the kindness and compassion she showed throughout her life." He turned to Mr. Tillman, his expression serious. "Mr. Tillman, if you're willing, I'd like for you to be the charity's first beneficiary. Your case, your struggle and your hope could help us shape the Foundation's mission and reach others in similar situations." Mr. Tillman's eyes filled with tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being proposed. I don't know what to say," he whispered. "This is more than I ever could have imagined. Of course, I'm willing. If my story can help others, I want to share it." Agnes, who had been listening with growing amazement, finally found her voice. "Johnny," she said, her tone a mix of gratitude and awe, it's incredible, but are you sure? Starting a charity is a huge undertaking." Johnny nodded, his resolve evident in his stance. "I'm sure, Mrs. Bennett, I have the resources and the connections to make this happen, and more importantly, I have the motivation. Sharon's story, Elle's compassion, Mr. Tillman's struggle. They've shown me that this is something that needs to be done." Elle, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Tillman," she said, her young face serious, "Mommy would be so happy to know that she's helping you get better, and now she'll be helping lots of other people too." Mr. Tillman reached out, gently patting Elle's hand. "You're right, Elle," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you should know that you played a big part in this too. If you hadn't thought of me, hadn't asked Mr. Depp to help, none of this might be happening. Your mother would be so proud of you." Elle's eyes widened at this, a mix of surprise and pride crossing her face. She looked up at Johnny, then at her grandmother. "Really?" she asked softly. "I helped?" Agnes knelt down, wrapping her arms around her granddaughter. "You did, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with love and pride. "Your kindness and your big heart, that's your mother's legacy living on through you." Johnny, seeing the emotional impact of the moment, quietly excused himself. "If you'll pardon me for a moment," he said, "I need to make a few calls to get this process started." As Johnny stepped outside to make his calls, the atmosphere in Mr. Tillman's living room was charged with a newfound energy. What had begun as a day of mourning had transformed into something extraordinary, the birth of a mission that would touch countless lives. Outside, Johnny first called his assistant, outlining his plans for the charity and setting the wheels in motion. Legal frameworks, funding arrangements, partnerships with hospitals, all of these would need to be put in place, and quickly. As he ended the call, Johnny paused for a moment, looking back at the house where Ella, Agnes and Mr. Tillman waited. He thought about Sharon Bennett, a woman he had never met but whose story had moved him so deeply. He thought about the countless others out there facing similar battles, caught between hope and despair. With renewed determination, he made another call, this time to his police friend David. "David," he said as soon as the call connected, "it's Johnny. I need to ask for another favor. It's about Sharon Bennett and her family." As Johnny explained the situation, and inquired about the procedure to reclaim the confiscated items, he felt a sense of purpose unlike anything he had experienced before. The simple mahogany casket and marble headstone in the cemetery were no longer just markers of a life lost. They were the foundation of a living legacy, one that would bring hope to many. Inside the house, Johnny entered to the scene of Elle sat between her grandmother and Mr. Tillman, her young face alight with a mix of emotions: grief for her mother, hope for Mr. Tillman, and a growing understanding of the impact one act of kindness could have. Agnes stood up as soon as she saw Johnny entered through the door and reached out, grasping Johnny's hand in a gesture of profound gratitude. "Mr. Depp, Johnny," she corrected herself. "I don't know how we can ever thank you for everything you've done. You've given us back pieces of Sharon we thought were lost forever, and now you're offering hope to Robert. It's overwhelming." Johnny squeezed her hand reassuringly. "There's no need for thanks, Mrs. Bennett. I'm just glad I could help. And speaking of help," he turned back to Mr. Tillman, "I have talked to my assistant about getting you the treatment you need. I have some connections at a few hospitals that specialize in cancer treatment. With your permission, I'd like to help you. My assistant will contact you tomorrow about the details." Mr. Tillman nodded eagerly, hope shining in his eyes for the first time in months. "Yes, please, I can't believe this is happening. It's like Sharon is still looking out for us, even now." Elle smiled at this, a small but genuine expression that lit up her young face. "Mommy always said we should help our neighbors," she said softly. "I think she'd be happy we're helping Mr. Tillman." As the afternoon sun broke fully through the clouds, bathing Mr. Tillman's living room in warm light, it felt like a new chapter was beginning. Not just for those gathered in that small house, but for countless others whose lives would be touched by the legacy of Sharon Bennett and the compassion of a little girl named Elle. The story that had begun with a lonely funeral was transforming into something much larger, a tale of hope, of community, and of the enduring power of kindness. And as Johnny Depp re-entered the house, ready to share the next steps of their journey, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would continue to unfold in ways none of them could yet imagine.